"Oh, come on. You really expect us to believe this is your car?" The officer's voice dripped with open mockery as he circled the gleaming black luxury SUV, dragging his fingers slowly across the polished surface as if searching for proof that didn't exist. His partner let out a short laugh, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "People like you don't usually drive something worth $96,000, the second officer added, shaking his head as though the conclusion had already been decided. The woman stood still, her expression controlled. Her posture dignified, but the disrespect came faster now. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where we can see them. Don't make this harder than it already is." A few bystanders raised their phones, sensing the tension building. One officer tilted his head slightly, studying her face with thinly veiled contempt before pulling the handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click echoed louder than expected. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply watched them, as though she already knew something they didn't. Within days, the same officers publicly humiliating her would be named in a federal lawsuit demanding $7 million in damages. But in that moment, they believed they were in control. "Stay with this story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is in your city. And if you believe dignity should never depend on appearances, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next." Long before the flashing patrol lights reflected against the polished surface of the luxury SUV, Aaliyah Carter had built a life defined by discipline, precision, and quiet resilience. At 34 years old, Aaliyah was already known in Atlanta's legal circles as someone who did not waste words. She did not raise her voice in courtrooms. She did not rely on theatrics. Her reputation came from preparation so meticulous that opposing counsel often realized too late that every argument they planned to use had already been anticipated and dismantled. Her colleagues described her as composed, focused, unshakable. But those who knew her story understood that composure had been earned. Aaliyah grew up in Decatur, Georgia, in a modest two-bedroom home filled with books, handwritten notes, and a quiet understanding that excellence was not optional. It was protection. Her mother, Denise Carter, taught high school English for nearly 30 years. Her father, Malcolm Carter, worked as an electrical engineer, often reminding her that competence spoke louder than approval. "Work twice as hard," her father would say calmly at the dinner table, "not because you're less capable, but because the world will sometimes pretend you are." Aaliyah listened. She learned early how to observe a room before speaking, how to notice tone before words, how to distinguish between genuine curiosity and disguised doubt. By the time she graduated high school as valedictorian, she already understood something many adults took decades to grasp: respect for some people was never freely given. It had to be established, reinforced, and defended. Harvard Law School refined what life had already shaped. There, Aaliyah developed the reputation of someone who read every footnote, every precedent, every dissenting opinion. While classmates competed for internships with corporate firms promising six-figure starting salaries, Aaliyah gravitated toward civil rights litigation cases that demanded endurance rather than applause. She was not interested in comfortable victories. She was interested in necessary ones. After graduation, she declined multiple offers from prestigious firms in New York and Washington, choosing instead to return to Atlanta. Some colleagues questioned the decision. Others quietly admired it. Atlanta was not simply where she grew up. It was where she understood the work mattered most. By 32, she had already participated in several high-profile cases involving wrongful termination, discriminatory lending practices, and unlawful search procedures. Her name began appearing in legal journals. Advocacy groups began requesting her consultation. Judges began recognizing her preparation. Still, Aaliyah maintained a routine so consistent that even her closest friends could predict her schedule with surprising accuracy. Morning began at 5:45 a.m. Black coffee, no sugar. 30 minutes reviewing case notes before sunrise, 45 minutes at a small private gym 2 blocks from her condominium. By 7:30, she was dressed with deliberate simplicity, structured blazer silk blouse, tailored trousers, neutral colors, nothing distracting, nothing exaggerated. Her appearance communicated professionalism without inviting commentary. Control, she believed, began with presentation. On the morning everything changed, the sky over Atlanta carried the pale gold hue of early autumn. The air held that subtle crispness that suggested summer had finally loosened its grip. Aaliyah stepped into the underground parking structure beneath her building, the soft echo of her heels punctuating the quiet space. Her vehicle waited exactly where she had left it, the evening before a black 2024 Range Rover autobiography, its finish reflecting the geometric lines of the concrete ceiling above. The SUV had not been an impulsive purchase. She had spent nearly 3 years driving a modest sedan while carefully reviewing financial priorities. Student loans had been paid off aggressively, investments allocated conservatively, emergency savings calculated with the same precision she applied to legal arguments. When she finally decided to purchase the vehicle, she did so without ceremony. No social media announcement, no celebratory dinner. Just a signature on a purchase agreement and a quiet acknowledgement that her work had created stability. Her parents, once worried, might remain uncertain. She appreciated the engineering, the safety features, the reliability. Status had never interested her. Control did. As the engine started, the dashboard illuminated softly, displaying the time, 8:12 a.m. Her first meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. at the Whitmore Grand Hotel downtown, a location often used by corporate clients seeking discretion. The client she was meeting that morning had requested privacy regarding documentation connected to an employment discrimination claim involving a regional logistics company. Sensitive material, extensive documentation, potential federal implications. Aaliyah had reviewed the preliminary file twice the previous evening. Patterns had already begun to emerge. She guided the SUV smoothly into morning traffic, merging into the steady rhythm of commuters moving toward office towers, municipal buildings, and construction sites that reflected Atlanta's constant expansion. The city was awake, but not yet hurried. Traffic signals changed in measured intervals. Pedestrians crossed intersections with coffee cups in hand. Delivery trucks idled near sidewalks. Normalcy surrounded her. Predictability. Order. 40 minutes later, the Whitmore Grand appeared ahead, its glass facade, reflecting the movement of passing vehicles. Valet attendants in tailored uniforms coordinated arrivals with quiet efficiency. Aaliyah preferred self-parking. Control again. She guided the SUV into a public metered space along the side of the hotel, parallel parking, with practiced precision. The vehicle aligned cleanly with the curb. Engine off. Brief silence. She reached into the passenger seat, collecting a slim leather portfolio containing documents arranged with color-coded tabs. Her phone displayed a reminder notification. Client meeting 9 a.m., conference room B. As she stepped out of the vehicle, the morning sun reflected sharply across the SUV's polished surface. She pressed the lock button. A soft confirmation chime sounded. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual. No raised voices, no tension in the air. Just the ordinary rhythm of a weekday morning in one of the busiest districts in the city. Aaliyah adjusted the cuff of her blazer and began walking toward the hotel entrance, unaware that within minutes everything about that ordinary morning would be questioned. And not because of anything she had done, but because of what someone else assumed. Aaliyah had barely taken 3 steps away from the driver's door when she heard the low hum of an engine slow behind her. At first, she assumed it was simply another vehicle searching for parking along the crowded downtown street. Morning traffic in this part of Atlanta often required patience, and drivers frequently paused mid-lane while scanning for open meters. But then came the sound of tires pressing firmly against asphalt. A vehicle stopping deliberately. Not passing. Stopping. She glanced over her shoulder just as the black and white patrol cruiser angled toward the curb, its presence abrupt enough to disrupt the quiet rhythm of pedestrians moving along the sidewalk. The car's engine remained running. Inside, two uniformed officers exchanged a brief look before stepping out almost simultaneously. Their movements were not rushed. They were controlled. Purposeful. The taller officer adjusted the front of his vest, his hand resting near the radio clipped to his shoulder. His partner removed his sunglasses slowly, revealing narrowed eyes already fixed on Aaliyah with an intensity that suggested a conclusion had already been formed. "Ma'am," the taller officer called out, his tone neutral but firm, step away from the vehicle. Aaliyah paused. There was something in the phrasing that immediately signaled this was not a casual inquiry. Still, her training and her temperament encouraged calm first. Clarification second. Escalation never. She turned fully toward them, maintaining a polite distance. "Yes, officer." The shorter officer circled the front of the SUV, his gaze sweeping across the license plate before lingering briefly on the vehicle's glossy finish. "Is this your car?" he asked, though the phrasing sounded less like a question and more like a pre-written line delivered out of routine. "Yes," Aaliyah replied evenly. "It is." The two officers exchanged another glance, a silent communication, a confirmation of something unstated. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching this description about 45 minutes ago." The taller officer explained, his voice calm, but lacking any visible curiosity about the possibility of error. Aaliyah felt the smallest shift in her chest. Not fear, recognition. Situations like this did not always begin loudly. Often they began quietly, with assumptions, with incomplete information, with conclusions reached before facts were confirmed. "There must be some mistake," she said, reaching carefully into her portfolio to retrieve the envelope containing her registration and insurance documents. "I purchased this vehicle 3 months ago from Northside Land Rover. I have the title documentation in my records as well." Her movements were slow, deliberate, visible. Experience had taught her that calm clarity often prevented unnecessary complications. But something in the officer's posture did not change. No softening, no curiosity, only continuation. "Keep your hands where we can see them," the shorter officer instructed, his voice slightly sharper now. Aaliyah paused, mid-motion. "My documents are in this envelope," she explained evenly, holding it at chest level without extending it toward them yet. "I'm removing the registration card." The taller officer stepped closer to the driver's door, peering briefly through the tinted window before returning his attention to her. "Dispatch flagged the VIN connected to a theft report this morning," he said. The statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. Around them, the quiet awareness of passers-by began to grow. Two pedestrians slowed their pace. A man standing near the hotel entrance subtly lifted his phone. Across the street, a barista placing outdoor chairs glanced over more than once. Moments like these had a way of attracting attention before anyone fully understood what was happening. Aaliyah removed the registration card slowly and extended it carefully. "This should resolve the confusion," she said calmly. The shorter officer accepted the card, glancing at it briefly, before passing it to his partner. The taller officer examined the document for less than 3 seconds before exhaling through his nose. "That's not what our system is showing," he replied flatly. Aaliyah's expression remained composed, but her mind began cataloging details automatically. Time, location, witnesses, tone, word choice. The shorter officer shifted his weight, glancing once more at the SUV before letting his gaze travel back toward Aaliyah in a way that felt less procedural, and more evaluative. "We see this kind of situation more often than you might think," he said. The phrasing carried weight beyond its literal meaning. Aaliyah heard it clearly, understood it clearly, but she did not respond emotionally. "May I ask what specific report you are referencing?" she asked calmly. "Because I can provide proof of purchase documentation immediately." Instead of answering, the taller officer reached for his radio. "Dispatch, confirm stolen vehicle alert connected to plate number." He read the plate aloud. Static crackled briefly before a voice responded through the small speaker clipped to his vest. "Plate returns possible match to reported stolen Range Rover Black reported missing from Buckhead residence approximately 1 hour ago. Possible match. Not confirmed. Possible." Aaliyah noticed the wording instantly. "Officer," she said evenly, "possible match indicates the need for verification, not assumption. I am fully willing to cooperate, but I would appreciate confirmation through the VIN displayed on the vehicle dashboard." The shorter officer tilted his head slightly. The movement subtle, skeptical. "You can step away from the car," he repeated. The phrasing had shifted. Not a request, an instruction. Aaliyah complied, taking 2 measured steps backward, maintaining visible hands. Her heartbeat remained steady, but the situation was no longer routine. The taller officer opened the driver's side door without asking permission, leaning inside briefly to examine the VIN plate visible through the windshield. Several seconds passed, then more. He stepped back slowly. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That number still needs verification," he said. More pedestrians slowed now. Phones were no longer subtle. At least 3 people were recording openly. Aaliyah could feel the atmosphere changing, the quiet curiosity of strangers transforming into alert observation. Public space carried public consequence. "Am I being detained?" she asked calmly. The shorter officer hesitated just long enough for the pause to be noticeable. "We just need to clarify ownership," he replied. "Clarification does not require escalation." Aaliyah responded evenly. The taller officer's expression hardened slightly. "Ma'am," he said, his tone firmer now, "step away from the vehicle immediately." The repetition carried a shift in authority, in assumption, in direction. Aaliyah complied again, taking another step backward, but the tension had already begun to crystallize. Something unspoken had entered the interaction, something heavier than procedure, something rooted deeper than documentation. Across the street, someone whispered quietly, "Why are they stopping her?" Another voice. "Is that her car?" Aaliyah noticed the subtle change in the officer's stance. Feet positioned wider, hands closer to their belts. Prepared, decided. And then the shorter officer spoke words that shifted everything. "For now, we're going to need you to place your hands behind your back." The sentence landed with quiet force, not because of its volume, but because of its implication. The morning that had begun with routine structure had now entered territory defined by assumption. Public assumption, legal assumption, personal assumption. And Aaliyah understood something with absolute clarity. This moment was no longer about a vehicle. It was about perception. And perception, once activated, rarely slowed on its own. She looked briefly at the growing number of phones raised around her, then back at the officers. Calm, controlled, still composed, but now fully aware that everything happening would soon exist far beyond this street corner. The air felt heavier, the space quieter. Even the distant sound of traffic seemed muted, because everyone present understood something irreversible had just begun. The request did not sound loud. It did not need to. For now, We're going to need you to place your hands behind your back." The words carried the weight of a decision already made. Aaliyah felt the subtle tightening of attention around her, as if the air itself had grown more focused. The sidewalk moments earlier, filled with ordinary morning movement, had slowed into cautious stillness. People did not stop completely, but they did not look away either. Every motion now felt amplified, every second heavier. She kept her voice calm. "Officer," she said carefully, "am I under arrest?" The taller officer did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward his partner, then toward the small gathering crowd forming along the curb. "It's a temporary detention while we confirm ownership," he said finally. Temporary. The word sounded procedural, neutral, but the positioning of his body communicated something else entirely. Authority reinforced, control asserted. Aaliyah's training guided her response. Clarity first, documentation second, emotion never. "I am fully cooperating," she said evenly. "My registration is valid, my identification matches the ownership record, and the VIN can be verified through your system." Her tone remained respectful, measured, but the shorter officer's expression did not soften. "We hear that a lot," he replied, the phrase carrying an edge of dismissiveness that did not belong in routine verification. Aaliyah noticed the shift instantly, not just in language, in posture. Both officers now stood closer than necessary for a simple document check, closer than protocol required for a cooperative individual presenting valid paperwork. Behind them, another patrol vehicle slowed as it approached the scene. The driver inside briefly surveyed the situation before pulling to the curb. Back up. Not requested audibly, but clearly expected. The additional presence altered the dynamic immediately. 2 officers became 4. Curiosity became spectacle. Aaliyah remained still, her hands visible at her sides. "I would prefer not to be restrained when I have complied with every request," she said calmly. The taller officer's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, step away from the vehicle and place your hands behind your back." Again, not a request, a directive. The repetition felt intentional, as though persistence alone would transform uncertainty into justification. Aaliyah took one controlled breath, then another. This was no longer a misunderstanding that would resolve quickly. The presence of multiple officers suggested something else had taken hold. A presumption. One officer from the second patrol car adjusted his body camera, ensuring it faced forward. The small red indicator light blinked steadily. Recording. Documentation worked both ways. Aaliyah slowly moved her hands behind her back, not in surrender, in strategy. She understood something many bystanders did not. Escalation rarely benefited the person already being scrutinized. Her wrists aligned gently at the base of her spine, fingers relaxed. Non-threatening, compliant, still dignified. The shorter officer stepped forward, retrieving the handcuffs from his belt with a practiced motion. The metallic sound as they opened seemed louder than expected. A quiet click, a subtle shift in power. A woman standing near the hotel entrance whispered softly to the man beside her. "Is she resisting?" "No," he murmured back. "She hasn't done anything." Phones remained raised, some openly recording, others pretending not to. Public moments created permanent records, and everyone present understood that something about this interaction felt disproportionate. "We just need to figure out why this vehicle was flagged." The taller officer stated his tone, suggesting reassurance but lacking any acknowledgement of the visible escalation. Aaliyah's voice remained steady. "Then I suggest verifying the VIN through dispatch before proceeding further." The shorter officer paused briefly, just long enough for uncertainty to flicker across his face, but only briefly. Procedure continued. Cold metal touched her wrist. Then the other. The cuffs closed with 2 firm clicks. Not aggressively, but not gently either. Functional. Decisive. Final enough to shift perception immediately. Across the street, someone spoke louder than intended. "They're arresting her," another voice responded. For what? No answer came. Because no clear explanation had yet been given. One of the newly arrived officers stepped closer to the SUV, examining the exterior more closely now, as though visual inspection might reveal justification. The morning sunlight reflected sharply against the vehicle's polished surface, making every fingerprint visible, every movement noticeable. The taller officer spoke into his radio again. "Dispatch, confirm VIN associated with reported stolen vehicle." Static answered. Then silence. Seconds stretched longer than they should. Aaliyah remained composed, her posture upright despite the restraint. Humiliation did not always appear dramatic. Sometimes it appeared quiet, controlled, public. A valet attendant near the hotel entrance shifted uncomfortably, uncertain whether to intervene or remain distant. Intervention rarely occurred in moments involving uniforms. Authority often discouraged curiosity, but discomfort remained visible. The shorter officer adjusted the positioning of the cuffs slightly, ensuring they were secure, but not visibly causing pain. Still, the symbolism carried weight. Restraint implied wrongdoing. Assumption implied guilt. Across the sidewalk, a woman lowered her phone slowly, her expression conflicted. "This doesn't feel right," she said quietly. Her companion nodded, but neither stepped forward. Social pressure rarely encouraged confrontation with authority. The taller officer finally received a response through his radio. The voice was faint, distorted by static. "VIN. Still checking. Possible discrepancy. Possible discrepancy." Again, uncertainty. Again, incomplete confirmation. Yet the cuffs remained. Aaliyah's gaze moved calmly from one officer to another. Not confrontational, observational, measured. "You are detaining me without confirmed probable cause," she stated evenly. The shorter officer avoided direct eye contact. "We are following procedure." Procedure. A word often used broadly enough to avoid immediate challenge. Behind them, a small cluster of pedestrians had gathered, now their presence forming a loose semicircle of witnesses. No shouting. No confrontation. Just attention. Focused. Unavoidable. The city continued moving around them, car engines passing footsteps, echoing along pavement, distant horns blending into ambient noise, but the small space surrounding the SUV had become its own contained moment. Isolated, charged, documented. The taller officer rested one hand lightly on the edge of the open car door, scanning the interior again, as if expecting evidence to appear simply because scrutiny increased. But nothing changed. Nothing confirmed wrongdoing. Nothing justified escalation beyond assumption. Still, the process continued. "Do you have anyone we can contact regarding the vehicle?" one officer asked. "I am the registered owner," Aaliyah replied calmly. The officer nodded slowly, as though acknowledging the statement without accepting it. Authority often preferred its own timeline, its own verification, its own conclusions. But the presence of cameras complicated that control. Public documentation created accountability that private interactions sometimes avoided. Aaliyah remained still, composed, but now fully aware that the situation had crossed an invisible threshold. A routine morning had transformed into a public test of dignity, and tests of dignity rarely remained isolated incidents. They echoed. They spread. They demanded answers. The radio crackled again. this time louder, more urgent. Every officer present shifted slightly, attention drawn toward the small device clipped to the taller officer's shoulder. Whatever came next would determine whether this moment ended quietly or became something much larger than anyone present had anticipated. The faint crackle from the officer's radio did not immediately bring clarity. Instead, it deepened the silence that had settled over the sidewalk. "Stand still," the shorter officer instructed, though Aaliyah had not moved at all. The command felt less necessary than performative, a reinforcement of authority rather than a response to behavior. Aaliyah kept her shoulders relaxed, her breathing controlled. The metal cuffs pressed cool against her skin, firm but not painful, their presence symbolic long before physical discomfort could register. 2 additional pedestrians had stopped, now drawn not by noise, but by tension. One man adjusted the angle of his phone, discreetly pretending to scroll while ensuring the scene remained in frame. A woman in business attire paused near the crosswalk, her expression tightening as she tried to understand what could justify such a public display. The taller officer spoke quietly into the radio again, turning slightly away from the growing crowd. "Dispatch confirms status on VIN verification." Static answered once more, then delay. Moments stretched long enough for interpretation to fill the gaps. The shorter officer shifted his stance, resting his thumbs along the edge of his utility belt. His gaze traveled deliberately across Aaliyah's clothing, the structured charcoal blazer, the silk blouse, the tailored trousers, as if attempting to reconcile appearance with assumption. "We get all kinds of stories," he muttered, just loud enough to be overheard. The phrase hung between explanation and insinuation. Aaliyah did not respond. Silence, she understood, often exposed more than argument. Another bystander stepped closer to the edge of the sidewalk, lowering her voice as she spoke to the person beside her. "She doesn't look like she did anything." The reply came in a whisper. "They always say that." Public opinion rarely formed slowly. It aligned quickly with whatever narrative appeared most visible. One of the backup officers moved toward the rear of the SUV, crouching slightly to inspect the license plate more closely. He ran the plate number through a handheld device, the small screen reflecting pale blue light across his face. Nothing about the vehicle suggested urgency. Nothing indicated flight risk. Still, the optics of restraint created implication. Aaliyah could feel the weight of observation pressing from every direction. Not hostility. Not yet. But curiosity sharpened by uncertainty. "Ma'am," the taller officer said, finally, turning back toward her, "we're trying to determine how this vehicle came into your possession." The phrasing shifted responsibility without evidence. Carefully. Strategically. Aaliyah's voice remained calm. "I purchased it legally from an authorized dealership. The documentation is already in your possession." The shorter officer exhaled lightly, shaking his head, as if unconvinced. "You'd be surprised what paperwork can look like these days," he said. Another comment positioned carefully between doubt and accusation. Aaliyah noticed a subtle reaction from someone standing behind the officers. A middle-aged man in a navy suit frowned openly now, no longer attempting to hide his concern. "This seems excessive," he murmured under his breath. But again, no one stepped forward directly. Authority created invisible boundaries. Even discomfort rarely crossed them. The officer near the rear of the vehicle stood glancing toward his colleagues. "No visible tampering," he said quietly. The shorter officer nodded, but did not alter his stance. Aaliyah felt the sun warm the side of her face, the light reflecting off the SUV's surface bright enough to cause several bystanders to shield their eyes briefly. Time moved differently now. Slower. Thicker. The absence of immediate resolution magnified every detail. One of the pedestrians began speaking more audibly. "Why is she in cuffs if they're still checking?" Another voice responded. "Because they think she stole it. But they don't know that." The exchange carried just far enough to reach the officer's awareness. The taller officer adjusted his posture slightly, straightening his shoulders. Procedure once visible to the public often became performance. "We are conducting a lawful investigation," he said, clearly, his voice projecting just enough to address the surrounding attention. The phrasing sounded rehearsed, structured, institutional. But Aaliyah recognized something else beneath the tone. Uncertainty. Not about process, but about outcome. Another patrol vehicle passed slowly along the street, its occupants glancing toward the scene before continuing forward. The moment had already become noticeable beyond the immediate sidewalk. Moments like these rarely remained contained. Someone across the street spoke into a phone quietly. "I think something is happening outside the Whitmore." Information spread quickly. Faster than confirmation. Faster than correction. The shorter officer adjusted the positioning of Aaliyah's wrists slightly, ensuring the cuffs remained secure but visible. Symbolism mattered. Visibility shaped narrative. Narrative shaped perception. Aaliyah's gaze remained forward, calm but alert. She had encountered bias before, assumption before, but rarely had it unfolded this publicly, this visibly, this unnecessarily. The taller officer's radio crackled again. Both officers looked toward it simultaneously. The voice from dispatch sounded clearer this time, though still partially obscured by background noise. "VIN confirmation, still pending, database delay, delay, again delay." Yet escalation had already occurred. Aaliyah felt a quiet understanding settle within her. This was no longer simply about vehicle verification. It was about interpretation. Interpretation shaped by perception long before facts could intervene. One of the bystanders lowered his phone briefly, turning toward another witness. "This is going to end up online," he said. "It already is," the other replied. Aaliyah noticed the slight tightening of the taller officer's jaw. Public visibility altered institutional comfort. Documentation created permanence, and permanence demanded explanation. Still, neither officer moved to remove the cuffs. Still, no apology emerged. Still, the assumption lingered in the air, unspoken but powerful. The shorter officer glanced once more at the SUV, then back at Aaliyah. "You understand why we have to check," he said. The statement framed inevitability where discretion might have existed. "I understand the importance of verification," Aaliyah replied calmly. "I do not understand the necessity of humiliation." The word lingered between them. Humiliation. Not shouted, not dramatic, simply accurate. For the first time, the shorter officer hesitated visibly. Just a fraction of a second. But long enough for awareness to register. Long enough for doubt to exist. Behind them, a young woman spoke softly, but clearly. She hasn't even raised her voice. Another voice responded. They already decided. The officers remained still. Procedure continued. But the atmosphere had shifted. Public scrutiny had grown sharper. Expectation heavier. And the moment no longer belonged solely to those wearing badges. Because now witnesses existed. Multiple angles, multiple perspectives, multiple records. And records once created rarely disappeared. The radio crackled again, louder now, more insistent. Whatever information was about to arrive would either justify everything that had happened, or reveal something far more troubling. By the time the radio crackled again, the moment had already begun its quiet migration beyond the sidewalk. Not through official statements, not through confirmed facts, through phones, through lenses, through fragments of reality captured in 30-second clips and uploaded before context could catch up. A young man standing near the hotel entrance had started recording almost immediately after the first officer approached Aaliyah. At first, his video appeared steady, Observational, the way people often record public encounters involving law enforcement, unsure whether what they were witnessing would matter. But as the handcuffs appeared, the framing shifted. The camera moved closer. Voices became clearer. The emotional temperature changed. He posted the video to his social media account less than 4 minutes later, captioning it simply, "Police arresting black woman outside Whitmore Hotel. She says the SUV is hers." Within minutes, the post began accumulating views. At first, a few dozen, then hundreds, then thousands. Another bystander standing across the street uploaded her own clip from a different angle. Her video captured the moment the second patrol car arrived, emphasizing the imbalance between the calm posture of the woman in handcuffs and the increasing number of officers surrounding her. Her caption read, "She looks calm." Why so many officers? The question invited interpretation. Interpretation invited reaction. Reaction invited amplification. By the time the first 15 minutes passed, the scene had already appeared on 3 separate platforms, each clip slightly different, but unmistakably connected by one shared image. A composed black woman in professional attire restrained beside a luxury vehicle while officers moved around her with visible suspicion. Context remained incomplete, but emotion did not require completeness. Comments began forming almost immediately. Some expressed concern, some expressed skepticism, some expressed anger. "This doesn't look right. They already decided she was guilty. Something feels off about this." Others defended the officer's actions. "Police have to investigate stolen vehicles. People lie about ownership all the time. We don't know the full story. Public opinion rarely waits for certainty. It responds to perception, and perception had already begun shaping narrative." Inside a co-working office space less than 2 miles away, Maya Thompson glanced down at her phone during a brief pause between meetings. A small notification banner caught her attention, a reposted video from a legal commentary account she followed. The caption read, "Attorney detained outside Whitmore Hotel." Maya frowned slightly, tapping the video. Her expression changed almost instantly. She recognized the profile, the posture, the unmistakable composure under pressure. "Aaliyah," she murmured quietly. Maya had worked alongside Aaliyah for nearly 3 years as a litigation coordinator, managing document preparation for several civil rights cases. She knew Aaliyah's schedule with near precision. She knew her habits, her routines, and she knew Aaliyah did not panic, even under pressure, especially under pressure. Maya replayed the video once, then again. Her stomach tightened. She opened her messaging application immediately. "Have you seen this?" She typed quickly into a private office group chat. Within seconds, responses began appearing. "That can't be her. It looks like her. Why is she in handcuffs? Where is this happening?" Maya typed quickly, "Outside Whitmore Hotel. She has a client meeting this morning." Another colleague responded almost immediately. "That SUV is hers. She just bought it this year." Silence followed for several seconds. Then one message appeared that shifted the tone entirely. This could complicate the pending filing. The pending filing referred to something only a handful of people knew about. A federal civil rights complaint involving allegations of discriminatory enforcement patterns connected to several departments across the metro area, including the department now detaining her. Maya's fingers moved quickly across her keyboard. "We need confirmation of what's happening." Within minutes, the small legal team began gathering information, checking court schedules, contacting local clerks, monitoring social media posts for updates. Meanwhile, outside the Whitmore Hotel, the number of observers had grown subtly but noticeably. Not a crowd, but no longer incidental. People slowed as they passed. Some paused briefly before continuing. Others remained at a distance, watching quietly. The presence of multiple phones changed the atmosphere. Officers could feel it. The subtle shift from private interaction to public documentation, from procedural encounter to recorded narrative. The taller officer spoke again into his radio, his voice measured but tighter now. "Dispatch, we need expedited confirmation on that VIN." Static responded. Then pause. Behind Aaliyah, one bystander adjusted the angle of her phone, ensuring the cuffs remained clearly visible in frame. Visibility created accountability. Accountability created pressure. Pressure altered timelines. Another video surfaced online, this one zoomed closer, capturing the exchange between Aaliyah and the officers when she calmly requested VIN verification before escalation. Her tone remained composed, measured, professional. Comments beneath the video began shifting noticeably. "She sounds reasonable." They cuffed her before confirming, "This doesn't make sense." Within 25 minutes, a small legal news blog reposted the clip with a brief headline, "Possible wrongful detention incident unfolding in downtown Atlanta." The wording remained cautious, but the implication carried weight. Back in the office, Maya placed a call to Aaliyah's direct line. No answer. Of course not. Aaliyah's phone remained inside her portfolio, now resting inside the SUV. Maya inhaled slowly, steadying her voice, before placing another call. This time to the firm's managing partner. "We may have an urgent situation," she said carefully. Across the city, the video count climbed steadily. 5,000 views, 10,000, 15,000. Numbers increased not because facts had been confirmed, but because the visual contrast captured attention, professional appearance, composed demeanor, public restraint, unanswered questions. Narratives form quickly when images appear inconsistent with expectation. A woman in business attire being handcuffed beside her own vehicle created cognitive friction. And cognitive friction encouraged sharing. Back on the sidewalk, Aaliyah remained still, aware now that the presence of phones extended far beyond physical witnesses. Public space had become digital space. Digital space created permanence. The shorter officer shifted slightly, scanning the growing number of observers with visible discomfort. What started as routine, he muttered quietly, is turning into something else. He was not wrong, because by the time the dispatch radio crackled again, the situation no longer existed only on that street corner. It existed across timelines, across screens, across perspectives, and somewhere within those expanding networks of observers, someone was already connecting details the officers had not yet considered. Details that would soon change everything. Inside the glass-walled conference room on the 22nd floor of Carter & Wynn Civil Rights Group, the atmosphere had shifted from routine focus to controlled urgency. Maya Thompson placed her phone flat on the polished wooden table, pressing play once more as the video looped silently for the third time in less than 5 minutes. Around her, 3 attorneys leaned forward, their expressions sharpening with each frame. The footage was clear enough to remove doubt. The woman in handcuffs was unmistakably Aaliyah Carter. The charcoal blazer, the measured posture, the calm composure even as uniformed officers positioned themselves around her vehicle. No raised voice, no sudden movement, no visible justification for escalation. "Pause it there," said Jordan Patel, senior litigation counsel, gesturing toward the moment where the officer first reached for the cuffs. Maya froze the frame. Jordan leaned closer, studying the interaction with the kind of analytical focus that had dismantled opposing arguments in federal courtrooms for nearly a decade. "She offered documentation," he said quietly. Maya nodded, "and requested VIN verification before escalation," she added. Jordan exhaled slowly. That's important. Across the table, managing partner Eleanor Wynne adjusted her glasses, her expression calm but intent. "How widely has this circulated?" she asked. "Approximately 20,000 views across multiple platforms in under 30 minutes, Maya replied, refreshing her screen again. "That number is increasing quickly." Eleanor folded her hands together, considering. Public exposure changed procedural timelines. When documentation existed beyond official control, institutional responses often accelerated. But speed did not always produce clarity. Sometimes it exposed deeper patterns. "What time was her meeting scheduled?" Eleanor asked. 9 a.m., Maya replied. "Conference room B at the Whitmore." Jordan leaned back slightly. "She would have arrived early," he said. "She always does." A brief silence settled across the room. Not uncertainty. Recognition. Recognition of the larger context surrounding the moment unfolding on that sidewalk. Because this was not occurring in isolation. 3 days earlier, Aaliyah had finalized draft revisions on a federal complaint involving multiple incidents of alleged racial profiling connected to traffic stops and property detentions across the Atlanta metropolitan area. The complaint included statistical analysis compiled over 18 months. Patterns of disproportionate enforcement. Disparities in probable cause determinations. Repeated dismissals of valid ownership documentation in vehicle stops involving minority drivers. The case was sensitive, complex, and potentially significant. Jordan tapped a finger lightly against the table. "She was scheduled to review final exhibits this afternoon," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "Yes." Maya's voice lowered. "The department involved in several documented stops is the same department detaining her now. The connection did not require elaboration. Everyone in the room understood the implications immediately. Coincidence remained possible, but coincidence rarely appeared this precisely timed. Jordan reopened the video, focusing on the moment where the taller officer opened the SUV door without invitation. That could become relevant, he noted. Eleanor stood slowly moving toward the large window overlooking the city skyline. Atlanta stretched outward beneath pale morning sunlight, its movement uninterrupted by the small but significant moment unfolding several blocks away. "We proceed carefully," she said calmly. "Measured. Deliberate. Strategic." Maya nodded already, drafting a brief internal memo summarizing the known facts. Timestamps, location, sequence of events visible in video, initial public reaction. Meanwhile, on the sidewalk outside the Whitmore Hotel, the officers remained focused on verification procedures they believed routine. But routine had already begun unraveling. The taller officer received another update through his radio, his brow tightening slightly as he listened. "Still delayed?" the shorter officer asked quietly. "System lag," the taller officer replied. "Technical delay. Administrative inconvenience." But neither officer yet understood that documentation was now occurring through additional channels. Uncontrolled channels. Unfiltered channels. A young woman standing near the hotel entrance quietly uploaded a clearer version of her footage, this one capturing the moment Aaliyah calmly referenced ownership documentation. Her caption read, "She keeps explaining calmly, but they still cuffed her." The phrasing framed interpretation. Interpretation-guided response. Within minutes, a legal commentary account reposted the video with added context. Unconfirmed reports suggest detained individual may be civil rights attorney. Speculation, but informed speculation. Patterns of professional attire, demeanor, and composure did not go unnoticed by viewers familiar with courtroom culture. Online audiences began asking questions. What attorney? Does anyone know her name? Why hasn't ownership been confirmed yet? Digital inquiry moved quickly, sometimes faster than official confirmation processes. Back inside Carter and Wynn's office, Eleanor turned back toward the conference table. Prepare a statement, she instructed calmly. Jordan looked up. Public or internal? Internal first, Eleanor replied. Then we determine whether public response becomes necessary. Maya nodded, opening a new document. Subject line: Incident Response, Preparation. Her fingers paused briefly over the keyboard. She understood something fundamental about Aaliyah's professional philosophy. Preparation did not imply aggression. It implied readiness. And readiness ensured that facts remained visible when interpretation attempted distortion. Jordan replayed the video once more, focusing on the officer's body language. They appear confident, he observed. Eleanor responded quietly. Confidence often precedes reconsideration. Across the city, view counts continued rising. 30,000, 40,000, 50,000. Engagement expanded not because complete facts existed, but because visible imbalance created emotional response. Observers recognized the asymmetry. Calm individual, multiple officers, incomplete explanation, visible restraint. Patterns felt familiar. Too familiar. Back on the sidewalk, Aaliyah remained composed. She had noticed the phones, the shifting expressions of observers, the growing awareness that this moment extended beyond immediate participants. Her legal training did not eliminate discomfort, but it did sharpen observation. Everything unfolding would soon exist within multiple records: official reports, digital footage, witness recollections, and consistency between those records would matter, significantly. The taller officer adjusted his stance slightly, the radio still clipped to his shoulder, emitting occasional static bursts. He did not yet know that somewhere less than 2 miles away, a legal team had already begun documenting this interaction with professional precision. Nor did he know that the woman standing calmly in handcuffs had spent years analyzing patterns remarkably similar to the one now unfolding around her, patterns involving assumption preceding confirmation, escalation preceding verification, authority preceding accountability. And as the radio crackled once more, carrying new information through compressed static, the officers remained unaware that this moment would soon intersect with documentation far more structured than the scattered clips circulating online. Because what they believed was a simple stolen vehicle inquiry was about to become something far more consequential. The atmosphere outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel had changed in a way no one could ignore. It was no longer just a roadside detention. It was a moment under observation, layered with tension, expectation, and a growing awareness that whatever happened next would not remain confined to this sidewalk. The number of onlookers had increased subtly, but significantly. People slowed their pace as they approached the scene, their curiosity blending with discomfort as they tried to interpret what they were witnessing. Some stopped briefly, pretending to check messages while quietly recording. Others stood at a distance, whispering quietly, their eyes moving between the officers and the restrained woman, standing beside the polished black SUV. The taller officer pressed 2 fingers lightly against the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Dispatch, we still need confirmation on the VIN," he said, his tone measured but noticeably more insistent than before. The reply came slower this time. "Database response delayed. System processing multiple requests. Standby. Delay again." Administrative language often softened uncertainty, but the growing public attention made delay feel heavier, more visible, more questionable. The shorter officer shifted his weight, glancing briefly toward the small cluster of bystanders now forming a loose semicircle along the curb. Phones were no longer subtle. At least 5 devices were clearly pointed in their direction. Public documentation altered behavior. Even for those accustomed to scrutiny, Aaliyah remained composed. Her posture upright despite the restraint. Her wrists rested steadily behind her back. Fingers relaxed, her breathing even. She had not asked further questions. She had not protested. But her silence was not passive. It was observant, measured, intentional. Across the street, 2 pedestrians had stopped entirely now, their conversation quiet but animated. "This doesn't feel routine," one said softly. The other nodded. They already cuffed her before confirming anything. Perception continued shaping narrative. Narrative continued shaping pressure. One of the backup officers stepped slightly closer to the SUV's front grille, examining the manufacturer badge, as if visual inspection might produce clarity that database systems had not yet provided. The polished surface reflected the morning light, sharply creating a stark contrast between the vehicle's pristine condition and the tension surrounding it. "Reported stolen from Buckhead residence," the shorter officer muttered quietly, referencing the initial dispatch summary. The taller officer nodded, but his expression no longer reflected the same level of certainty visible earlier. Time complicated confidence. Uncertainty complicated authority. Behind them, a man in a gray blazer spoke quietly into his phone. "Yes, I'm looking at it right now. Multiple officers. She's in cuffs. No, she's calm. Very calm." His voice carried just enough to reach the edge of the officer's awareness. Public narration had begun. Once narratives formed publicly, they rarely remained neutral. Aaliyah's eyes moved slowly across the small gathering crowd, not searching for sympathy, but acknowledging awareness. Awareness meant witnesses. Witnesses meant accountability. One of the officers from the second patrol vehicle adjusted his body camera once more, ensuring the recording angle remained unobstructed. The small, blinking indicator light reflected briefly against the SUV's dark finish. Documentation now existed on multiple devices, multiple perspectives, multiple timelines. The taller officer's radio crackled again. This time the voice on the other end sounded slightly clearer. "Dispatch to unit. VIN entry indicates possible clerical duplication, confirming numeric sequence." The phrasing caused a subtle shift in posture among the officers. Clerical duplication. Possible discrepancy. Language that suggested uncertainty within the original stolen vehicle report. But not yet confirmation. Still incomplete. Still unresolved. The shorter officer exhaled slowly, glancing briefly toward the growing number of observers before lowering his voice. "This is getting more attention than expected." The taller officer responded quietly. "Stay procedural." Procedure offered structure. Structure offered reassurance. But procedure did not always prevent escalation, especially when initial assumptions proved premature. Across the sidewalk, another phone notification appeared. A local independent journalist had reposted one of the videos, adding a brief caption, "Developing situation outside Whitmore Grand Hotel involving possible wrongful detention." The phrasing remained cautious, but the implication expanded visibility. View counts continued climbing. 40,000, 60,000, 80,000. Numbers increased not because the situation had escalated physically, but because the visual contrast continued to raise questions. Professional appearance, composed demeanor, public restraint, incomplete explanation. Cognitive dissonance invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited sharing. One bystander spoke quietly but audibly enough to carry, "They still haven't said what she did." Another responded, "Maybe they don't know." The possibility lingered uncomfortably in the air. Aaliyah remained still, her gaze calm but attentive. The weight of public observation did not appear to disturb her composure. If anything, it seemed to reinforce it. The taller officer stepped slightly away from the vehicle, adjusting the microphone on his radio again. "Dispatch clarify duplication issue," he said. Several seconds passed. Then a response, "Initial stolen vehicle report entered with partial VIN match. Cross-checking now. Partial match. Not full confirmation. Not verified identification." The distinction mattered. Significantly. One of the backup officers shifted his stance, glancing briefly toward the taller officer. "That changes things," he murmured quietly. But not yet publicly. Not yet definitively. The crowd remained patient but attentive. No shouting. No confrontation. Just awareness sharpened by unanswered questions. Across the street, a rideshare driver slowed momentarily, scanning the scene before continuing forward. Moments like this rarely remained isolated for long. Information traveled, curiosity expanded, context accumulated, and somewhere within that accumulation, patterns began emerging. The taller officer's jaw tightened slightly as he listened again to the radio transmission. "Dispatch will confirm full VIN sequence," momentarily, the voice said. Momentarily, a word suggesting resolution approaching, but not yet arrived. The shorter officer glanced once more at Aaliyah. Her posture had not changed. Her expression remained calm, observant, unwavering. He shifted his weight, subtly uncertainty now visible in the smallest details of body language, because the situation was no longer unfolding exactly as expected. Verification was taking longer. Public attention was increasing faster, and the possibility of procedural error had begun entering consideration. Across digital platforms, commentary continued expanding. Questions multiplied, speculation grew. And somewhere among the thousands of viewers now watching fragments of this moment unfold in real time, someone had already begun searching public records connected to vehicle registration data. Information that once confirmed would alter the trajectory of everything happening on that sidewalk. Because once the full VIN sequence was verified, the justification for everything that had already occurred would face scrutiny far more intense than the officers had anticipated. And scrutiny once activated rarely retreated quietly. The confirmation did not arrive dramatically. There was no sudden announcement, no raised voices, just the sharp crackle of the police radio followed by a pause long enough to pull every nearby sound into silence. "Unit on Whitmore. Full VIN verification complete." The taller officer pressed the radio closer to his shoulder, his brow tightening slightly as the voice continued. "Registered owner confirmed. Vehicle is not listed as stolen." For a brief second, no one moved. Not the officers, not the bystanders, not even the traffic flowing steadily behind the quiet tension of the scene. The words seemed to hover in the air, searching for a place to land. "Repeat," the taller officer said quietly, his voice more controlled than confident. "VN confirms registered owner Aaliyah Carter. No active theft report associated with this vehicle." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Heavier than accusation. Heavier than the metallic weight of the cuffs still secured around Aaliyah's wrists. The shorter officer glanced instinctively toward his partner, a flicker of something unfamiliar appearing across his expression. Uncertainty. Behind them, one of the backup officers shifted his stance, lowering the handheld device he had been using moments earlier. The narrative had changed, but the evidence had not changed quickly enough to prevent what had already happened. Aaliyah remained still, her posture steady, her breathing controlled. Her eyes moved calmly between the officers, not confrontational, not triumphant, simply observant. Measured. Waiting. The taller officer spoke into the radio again, his voice quieter now. Dispatch. Confirm origin of initial stolen vehicle report. The answer came quickly this time. Preliminary entry matched partial VIN digits from separate theft report logged earlier this morning. Entry flagged similarity, but not confirmed identification. Similarity, not identity. Possible match, not verified ownership conflict. Procedural caution had been replaced by procedural escalation, a detail that would matter later, significantly. Across the sidewalk, one bystander lowered his phone, slightly disbelief visible in his expression. They cuffed her without confirming. Another voice responded quietly. They already decided. The shorter officer stepped slightly closer to Aaliyah, his movements slower, now more deliberate. We're going to remove the restraints, he said, his tone noticeably more formal than before. Not apologetic, not explanatory, procedural. Again. The metallic click of the handcuffs opening echoed softly. The sound carried weight far beyond its volume. The cuffs loosened, then released. Aaliyah brought her hands forward, slowly rubbing one wrist gently where the pressure had rested moments earlier. She did not rush the motion. She did not dramatize discomfort. She simply allowed the moment to register. Public restraint had been visible. Public release would be equally visible. The taller officer cleared his throat slightly. There appears to have been a discrepancy in the system entry, he said. The phrasing remained careful. Institutional. But insufficient. Aaliyah's voice remained calm. A discrepancy that resulted in public detention, she replied evenly. The statement was not confrontational. It was factual. The difference mattered. Around them, several bystanders exchanged quiet glances, their expressions reflecting the shift in understanding now spreading through the small crowd. Phones remained raised. Documentation did not stop simply because the narrative had changed. In many cases, it intensified, because resolution created clarity. Clarity invited judgment. One of the backup officers stepped toward the SUV again, his earlier confidence replaced by a more cautious distance. The shorter officer returned the registration card to Aaliyah with careful precision. Thank you for your cooperation, he said. The phrase sounded automatic, rehearsed, detached from the visible imbalance that had occurred only minutes earlier. Aaliyah accepted the document calmly. I cooperated before the restraints, she replied quietly. The taller officer's posture stiffened slightly. No response followed immediately, because certain statements did not invite easy rebuttal. Across the street, a woman spoke softly to the person beside her. They should apologize. The man beside her nodded slowly, but no apology came. Not yet. Procedure often delayed acknowledgement. Institutional language often avoided admission, but visibility altered expectations. One of the bystanders stepped slightly closer, speaking carefully, but audibly. Why was she cuffed if the VIN wasn't confirmed yet? The question lingered. Not directed aggressively, but undeniably present. The shorter officer glanced briefly toward the taller officer. Unspoken communication passed between them. The type of silent exchange developed through shared training and shared understanding of institutional risk. The taller officer spoke carefully. The situation required verification. The explanation sounded insufficient even as it was spoken. Verification had not required restraint. Documentation had already been provided. Compliance had already been evident. Yet escalation had occurred. And escalation had been recorded. Aaliyah adjusted the sleeve of her blazer. Slowly, her movements calm, but deliberate. I would like the names and badge numbers of all officers present, she said evenly. The request shifted the atmosphere immediately. Formal, procedural, documented. The shorter officer nodded slowly, retrieving a small notepad from his uniform pocket. "Of course," he replied. Around them, the crowd remained quiet, observing, absorbing, understanding. Moments like this often marked transitions, from uncertainty to accountability, from assumption to scrutiny. One of the officers recited his name clearly, then badge number, then department unit identification, each detail recorded carefully, deliberately, publicly, because now the moment no longer belonged solely to internal reports. It existed across dozens of independent recordings, multiple perspectives, multiple timelines, and those timelines would soon converge. Aaliyah accepted the written information, calmly scanning the names briefly before placing the paper carefully into her portfolio, the same portfolio she had attempted to retrieve documentation from earlier, before escalation, before assumption, before public restraint. The taller officer spoke once more, his tone measured. "You are free to go." The words sounded simple. But simplicity did not erase consequence. Freedom restored did not erase public perception, nor did it erase the sequence of decisions that had preceded confirmation. Aaliyah paused briefly before responding. "Thank you," she said calmly, polite, professional, but unmistakably composed. As she turned toward the SUV, the quiet murmur of the bystanders continued softly behind her. Because everyone present understood something fundamental. The story did not end with the removal of the cuffs. In many ways, it had only just begun. For several seconds after the handcuffs were removed, the scene remained suspended in an uneasy quiet. Aaliyah flexed her fingers, gently restoring circulation where the metal had pressed firmly against her wrists. The faint indentations would fade within minutes, but the visibility of what had just occurred would not disappear nearly as quickly. She opened the driver's side door of the SUV with steady composure, retrieving her leather portfolio from the passenger seat. Her movements remained deliberate, controlled, not rushed, not reactive. Dignity, she believed, was most visible when tested publicly. Behind her, the officers remained positioned near the curb, their earlier certainty replaced with a more restrained stillness. The taller officer spoke briefly into his radio once more, his tone subdued, confirming that the situation had been resolved. Resolved. The word suggested completion, closure, finality. But across digital platforms, the narrative was only beginning to expand. Within minutes of the VIN confirmation, updated clips began circulating this time, capturing the moment the handcuffs were removed. The contrast between the earlier footage and the later frames sharpened public reaction. First the restraint, then the correction. The sequence mattered, because sequence suggested process, and process revealed decision-making. Online viewers quickly began piecing together the timeline. She gave them paperwork first. They cuffed her before confirming the VIN. This shouldn't have happened. Comments multiplied rapidly beneath reposted videos. Anger, concern, analysis, speculation. The story had moved beyond curiosity. It had entered scrutiny. Inside the Carter and Wynn office, Maya refreshed her screen again, watching view counts rise with surprising speed. 70,000, 90,000, 120,000. The clip showing the removal of the cuffs spread even faster than the initial detention video. Viewers responded strongly to visible reversals. Reversals implied error. Error implied responsibility. Jordan leaned forward slightly as he read through emerging commentary. "People are already asking questions about procedural justification," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. That was inevitable. Maya turned her laptop screen toward them, highlighting a post from a respected legal analyst account. If documentation was provided prior to restraint, probable cause justification becomes difficult to defend. Jordan exhaled slowly. That's accurate. Across the room, another notification appeared, this time from a journalist known for covering civil rights litigation. The message read, "Can anyone confirm whether the detained individual is attorney Aaliyah Carter?" Eleanor's expression remained composed, but her voice carried quiet resolve. "It will not remain unconfirmed for long." Back outside the Whitmore Hotel, Aaliyah placed her portfolio carefully on the passenger seat before closing the door gently. The sound of the latch clicking shut felt oddly final, not as closure, but as transition. One of the bystanders spoke softly as she passed. "I'm sorry that happened to you." Aaliyah nodded politely. "Thank you," she replied. Her voice carried no bitterness, no visible anger, only clarity. Because anger often distracted from strategy. Strategy required focus. The taller officer stepped slightly closer, maintaining professional distance. "Again, we appreciate your cooperation," he said. The phrasing remained procedural, but the tone carried less confidence now, less certainty. Because the presence of multiple recordings had altered the power dynamic. Documentation created accountability that extended beyond internal review. Aaliyah met his gaze calmly. "Cooperation was never the issue," she replied. The statement landed with quiet precision. Behind the officers, another bystander whispered, "She's a lawyer, isn't she?" "I think so." Recognition traveled quickly when visual composure aligned with professional expectation. Someone across the sidewalk typed rapidly on their phone, cross-referencing the name already circulating online. Within minutes, confirmation began appearing across several legal forums. Profile photo comparisons, bar association listings, published case summaries, attorney Aaliyah Carter, civil rights litigation specialist, federal court experience, successful settlements involving unlawful detention claims. The irony did not go unnoticed. A respected legal commentator posted, "If this is indeed attorney Carter, the implications become significant." Within minutes, the statement had been shared thousands of times. Public reaction shifted again, from curiosity to attention, from attention to anticipation. Because context reframed narrative. The woman in handcuffs was no longer anonymous. She was an experienced civil rights attorney known for litigating cases involving improper detention and procedural misconduct. Patterns began forming in public discussion. Not accusations, not conclusions, but recognition of relevance. Jordan's phone vibrated with an incoming message from a former colleague, now working as a federal clerk. "Is this your Aaliyah?" Jordan responded simply, "Yes." The reply arrived seconds later. "This is going to escalate quickly." Back outside the hotel, Aaliyah paused briefly before entering the driver's seat. She adjusted the mirror slightly. Her movements calm, unhurried. Observers remained nearby, but the emotional temperature had shifted. Sympathy had replaced uncertainty. Concern had replaced suspicion. Public understanding evolved quickly when new context emerged. The shorter officer cleared his throat quietly. "If you need any documentation of today's interaction," he said carefully, "you may submit a request through department channels." Aaliyah nodded once. "I am familiar with the process," she replied. The response carried quiet meaning. Professional familiarity, legal awareness, preparedness. The officer hesitated briefly, then nodded, because the exchange had shifted beyond routine interaction. Both sides now understood the broader implications. Across digital platforms, the original video had surpassed 200,000 views. Major legal commentary accounts began sharing analysis threads. Former prosecutors offered insight. Civil rights advocates highlighted procedural concerns. Journalists requested verification. The story had entered national visibility territory, not because of dramatic confrontation, but because of contrast. Authority exercised prematurely, correction delivered publicly, context revealing significance. Aaliyah started the engine. The soft hum of the vehicle filled the quiet space inside the SUV. For a moment, she allowed herself a single breath of stillness. Then she guided the vehicle carefully away from the curb, merging back into the steady rhythm of Atlanta's late-morning traffic. Behind her, the officers remained near the sidewalk, speaking quietly among themselves. Procedure had ended, but consequence had begun. Inside Carter and Wynn's office, Eleanor Wynn closed her laptop slowly. "Prepare the documentation timeline," she instructed calmly. Jordan nodded. Maya already had the file open, because the truth now carried momentum. And momentum, once visible, rarely slowed quietly, especially when the person placed in handcuffs was already prepared to challenge everything that had just occurred. By early afternoon, the incident outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel was no longer simply a viral video. It had become a legal timeline. Inside Carter and Wynn Civil Rights Group preparation moved with quiet precision. No raised voices, no visible urgency that might suggest panic. Just the steady rhythm of professionals who understood that moments like this were not emotional events, they were evidentiary events. Maya Thompson had already compiled a preliminary sequence of documentation. Time of initial detention, timestamp of first uploaded video, audio transcripts extracted from footage, frame-by-frame observations noting when Aaliyah presented documentation, when officers requested dispatch verification, and when restraints were applied. Accuracy mattered. Language mattered. Because language shaped interpretation. Jordan Patel reviewed the timeline, carefully adjusting phrasing where precision could eliminate ambiguity. "Replace approximately with exact time marker," he said quietly. Maya nodded, updating the document. Precision removed opportunities for misinterpretation. Across the conference table, Eleanor Wynn scanned the initial draft of what would soon become a federal filing. Not emotional, not dramatic, structured, measured, legally grounded. "The claim must remain focused," Eleanor said calmly. "We are not arguing inconvenience. We are addressing constitutional violation." Jordan nodded once. Fourth Amendment implications were already evident. Unreasonable detention, escalation without confirmed probable cause, public humiliation resulting from procedural disregard. Each point required careful articulation. Because federal courts did not respond to outrage. They responded to substantiated argument. Aaliyah entered the conference room at 2:18 p.m. Her expression composed, her posture unchanged from the footage already circulating widely online. Her wrists showed faint impressions where the cuffs had rested, but her demeanor reflected clarity rather than anger. Eleanor met her gaze. "Are you ready to proceed?" she asked. Aaliyah nodded once. Yes. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Because the decision had already formed the moment restraint occurred without confirmation. Jordan slid a printed copy of the timeline toward her. "We want to confirm sequence accuracy before finalizing language," he said. Aaliyah reviewed each entry carefully. Time markers aligned precisely with her recollection. Officer phrasing matched her memory. Sequence remained intact. They requested compliance before confirming VIN verification, she noted quietly. Maya highlighted the corresponding transcript. Captured clearly on 2 separate recordings, she confirmed. Aaliyah nodded slightly. Consistency across multiple recordings strengthened evidentiary reliability. Independent sources reduced dispute potential. Jordan placed a separate document on the table. Preliminary damages assessment. Projected reputational harm, Emotional distress. Violation of civil rights under federal statute. Total claim value $7 million. The number reflected more than financial compensation. It reflected deterrence, institutional accountability, legal recognition that procedural misconduct carried consequence. Eleanor spoke calmly. The figure is supported by precedent involving comparable violations under similar public conditions. Aaliyah did not react to the number itself. She understood the strategy behind it. Significant enough to signal seriousness, measured enough to withstand scrutiny. The complaint language referenced specific legal frameworks. 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. Violation of constitutional protection against unreasonable seizure, failure to conduct appropriate verification prior to restraint, public detention conducted without established probable cause. Jordan adjusted a paragraph slightly. We emphasize sequence, he said quietly. Sequence demonstrated decision-making. Decision-making demonstrated responsibility. Responsibility created liability. Across the city, news outlets had begun contacting Carter and Wynn, requesting comment. Journalists had already confirmed Aaliyah's professional identity through public bar records and prior case filings. Her name now appeared alongside headlines referencing wrongful detention concerns. Public interest had expanded beyond the initial video, because context reframed significance. A random detention invited curiosity. A civil rights attorney detained under questionable circumstances invited scrutiny. Eleanor's phone vibrated with an incoming message from a legal correspondent, requesting confirmation regarding potential filing. Eleanor silenced the notification without responding. Timing mattered. Public statements followed procedural action, never preceded it. Maya finalized formatting adjustments, ensuring all citations aligned with federal filing requirements. Each paragraph supported by reference, each claim supported by documented sequence, each statement verifiable. Aaliyah closed the document slowly, placing her hand lightly against the cover. Her voice remained calm. This is not about the vehicle, she said quietly. Jordan nodded. No, Eleanor added. It is about process. Because process determined fairness. Process determined trust. Process determined whether authority functioned as protection or presumption. The complaint outlined specific officer conduct. Failure to adequately review provided documentation. Premature use of restraints. Public escalation despite cooperative compliance. Each detail structured carefully to demonstrate pattern rather than isolated misjudgment. Patterns carried legal weight. Jordan gathered the documents into a single organized file. We will file electronically within the hour, he said. Aaliyah nodded. Outside the office, the city continued moving with ordinary rhythm. Traffic patterns unchanged, pedestrian flow uninterrupted. But within legal networks, awareness had already begun spreading. Professional communities monitored developments closely, because procedural violations often signaled broader institutional concerns. Within 40 minutes, the federal filing confirmation appeared. Case officially entered into court record. Jurisdiction established. Timeline formalized. The number would soon appear publicly, $7 million. Not symbolic, not arbitrary, calculated, structured, supported. Across digital platforms, speculation accelerated rapidly once confirmation of legal action emerged. Headlines began shifting language. Civil rights attorney files, federal lawsuit, following public detention. Legal complaint, alleges constitutional violation. $7 million claim filed after disputed arrest incident. Public reaction intensified. Because legal action transformed narrative into structure, structure demanded evaluation. Evaluation demanded response. Inside Carter and Wynn's office, Eleanor reviewed the filing confirmation email once more, then closed her laptop calmly. "We allow the process to proceed," she said. Aaliyah nodded once. Calm remained her most consistent strategy, because clarity often spoke louder than reaction. Across the city within the same department whose officers had applied restraints less than 6 hours earlier, notification of the federal filing began moving through administrative channels. Internal review protocols initiated. Legal counsel notified. Command staff alerted. Because federal litigation required response, formal response, structured response, documented response. And now the moment that had begun as a roadside assumption had become a matter of constitutional scrutiny, public scrutiny, legal scrutiny, institutional scrutiny. Because evidence did not disappear simply because correction followed error. Sequence remained visible, documentation remained accessible, and accountability once activated through federal filing, rarely resolved quietly. Within 48 hours of the federal filing, the narrative surrounding the incident outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel had shifted from speculation to structured scrutiny. Because once a federal complaint enters public record documentation, begins attracting attention from more than journalists and online commentators. Internal investigators begin reviewing conduct. Legal analysts begin examining procedural consistency. Oversight entities begin asking quiet but direct questions. And questions once formalized require answers supported by verifiable record. Inside the Atlanta Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, a request for documentation had already been submitted by City Legal Counsel. The request was routine in form, but serious in implication. Body camera footage. Dispatch communication transcripts. Initial incident report narrative. Computer-aided dispatch logs reflecting the original stolen vehicle entry. Timestamps documenting when the partial VIN match was entered into the system. And most importantly, confirmation of when the officers first became aware that the vehicle had not been confirmed as stolen. Because sequence determined accountability. If confirmation occurred after restraint justification required stronger articulation. If confirmation could have occurred before restraint, the justification weakened significantly. The distinction mattered legally. Inside a quiet administrative office on the 3rd floor of department headquarters, Lieutenant Marcus Delaney reviewed the preliminary summary of the incident. Delaney had supervised internal conduct reviews for nearly 9 years. His role required distance from public narrative, distance from political pressure, and distance from emotional reaction. Procedure-guided evaluation. Evidence-guided conclusion. He played the body camera footage, carefully watching without interruption as the interaction unfolded. Initial approach. Request for documentation. Presentation of registration card. Reference to possible VIN match. Escalation to physical restraint prior to confirmed verification. He paused the footage briefly, reviewing the timestamp, then continued. Professional composure from the detained individual remained consistent throughout. No visible resistance, no attempt to leave the scene, no escalation of tone, no physical interference with officer process. Delaney noted the sequence carefully, because consistency of behavior affected justification thresholds. If threat level remained low, escalation required stronger explanation. Another document displayed the initial dispatch entry. Partial 5IN similarity. Vehicle description match. Reported stolen earlier that morning from Buckhead residence. But the entry also contained an internal notation often overlooked by inexperienced reviewers. Preliminary match requires confirmation prior to enforcement action. Confirmation prior to enforcement action. Delaney leaned back slightly in his chair. The wording was not ambiguous. Procedure required verification before escalation beyond standard questioning. He opened the second file. Dispatch transcript timeline. Initial call reference. Officer request for confirmation. Database processing delay. Partial match clarification transmitted after detention had already occurred. Sequence again. Escalation preceding confirmation. The distinction remained consistent across records. Meanwhile, across digital platforms, public attention had continued expanding. Legal experts published detailed analysis threads explaining probable cause thresholds. Former prosecutors discussed the importance of verification prior to public detention. Civil rights organizations highlighted statistical data showing disproportionate escalation patterns in similar scenarios nationwide. The narrative was no longer driven by emotion alone. It was now supported by structured legal argument. A respected constitutional law professor posted a short commentary. When documentation is offered and compliance is clear, restraint prior to confirmation becomes difficult to justify under established precedent. The post gained traction quickly among legal professionals because the issue extended beyond one incident. It touched broader institutional trust. Inside city administrative offices, officials began reviewing risk exposure projections, financial liability calculations, reputational impact assessments, policy review considerations, public trust metrics. Because federal litigation rarely remained confined to individual officers, institutional procedure became subject to examination. Policy language became subject to revision. Training standards became subject to evaluation. Back at Carter and Wynne, Jordan Patel monitored developments quietly cross-referencing internal affairs procedures with publicly available departmental policy manuals. The language in their own guidelines emphasizes confirmation before escalation, he noted. Maya highlighted the relevant policy section on her screen. Use of restraints requires articulable risk beyond uncertainty of ownership status. Jordan nodded once. That will matter. Aaliyah remained composed as she reviewed the updates. Her focus remained on consistency between policy language and officer conduct, because discrepancies between written procedure and applied procedure often strengthened constitutional argument. Across the city, journalists began requesting interviews with civil rights advocates regarding broader implications of the case. Because individual incidents often illuminated systemic questions, patterns rarely appeared in isolation. They appeared through repetition, comparison, documentation. Inside internal affairs, Lieutenant Delaney closed the final file, slowly organizing the sequence in his mind. He had reviewed hundreds of conduct cases over the years. Some involved justified force, some involved procedural misunderstanding, some involved documentation error. But cases involving public restraint prior to confirmation of ownership typically required careful examination, particularly when multiple independent recordings captured consistent sequence. Consistency reduced interpretive flexibility. He marked the file for formal review recommendation, because procedural clarity demanded evaluation. Outside observers often misunderstood internal review processes. They assumed immediate conclusion, immediate accountability, immediate resolution. But institutional response often moved deliberately, carefully, step by step. Still, once documentation entered formal review channels, outcomes rarely disappeared entirely, because official record created traceable accountability. Across online platforms, public conversation had matured beyond outrage. It now included informed legal discussion, policy reference, historical comparison, civil rights precedent. The number $7 million appeared repeatedly in headlines. but increasingly commentary focused on principle rather than amount. Because financial settlement often represented acknowledgement of harm, acknowledgement of error, acknowledgement of needed change. Inside, Carter and Wynne. Eleanor. Wynne summarized the situation calmly. The evidence sequence remains consistent across independent recordings and internal documentation, she said. Jordan nodded. That reduces dispute variability. Aaliyah listened quietly, her expression thoughtful but steady. Because she understood something many observers did not. Legal accountability was not driven by emotional reaction. It was driven by verifiable sequence, consistent documentation, demonstrable deviation from established procedure. And now the sequence had been recorded from multiple perspectives: public, institutional, legal. Each reinforcing the same central fact: restraint had occurred before confirmation. Escalation had preceded certainty. And once that sequence became part of federal record, denial became significantly more difficult to sustain, because the truth supported by documentation rarely required amplification. It required recognition. Within 3 weeks of the federal filing, the situation had evolved from a single public incident into a broader institutional review. Because once legal scrutiny reaches the federal level, the focus rarely remains confined to one moment. It expands. Policies are examined. Training procedures are evaluated. Prior incidents are reconsidered through newly sharpened perspective. In Atlanta's municipal legal offices, attorneys representing the city had already begun analyzing potential exposure. The initial priority was not public messaging. It was internal risk assessment. Every recorded second of the encounter outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel had been reviewed repeatedly, frame by frame, audio transcript by audio transcript. Dispatch timeline aligned with officer body camera footage, each element examined for consistency between procedure and action. Consistency did not fully appear, and inconsistency created vulnerability. City officials understood something fundamental about federal civil rights litigation. It did not require malicious intent to establish liability. Deviation from established procedural safeguards could be sufficient, especially when the deviation resulted in public humiliation under documented circumstances. The legal memorandum prepared by the city's council outlined key points of concern: use of restraints prior to confirmed probable cause, failure to sufficiently weigh presented documentation, public setting amplifying reputational impact, multiple independent recordings reinforcing consistent sequence. Legal analysts reviewing the memorandum noted that juries often responded strongly to visible imbalance between perceived threat and level of force applied. In this case, the visual contrast had already shaped public understanding. Professional attire, calm demeanor, immediate compliance, restraints applied nonetheless. Because juries often assessed reasonableness through ordinary perception, not institutional assumption. Across the city, Internal Affairs continued its review, interviewing each officer involved in the encounter. Their statements aligned on one key assertion. They believed the vehicle matched the description of a reported stolen SUV. Belief alone, however, did not eliminate the requirement for verification, especially when documentation had been presented voluntarily. Lieutenant Marcus Delaney compiled the findings, carefully structuring the review language with professional neutrality. No emotional phrasing, no speculative interpretation, only sequence, timeline, procedure, deviation. Deviation did not imply misconduct automatically, but deviation required explanation. And explanation required consistency across multiple evidentiary sources. Meanwhile, Carter and Wynn Civil Rights Group continued preparing supporting exhibits to strengthen the federal claim. Jordan Patel coordinated expert opinion statements regarding procedural standards in vehicle stop investigations. Former law enforcement trainers provided written analysis, noting that restraint typically required articulable risk indicators beyond ownership ambiguity alone. Several experts referenced established departmental training manuals emphasizing de-escalation when subjects demonstrate cooperation and provide documentation. These professional assessments strengthened the legal argument without exaggeration. Because federal courts prioritized clarity over rhetoric. Maya Thompson continued monitoring public response trends, noting the gradual shift from viral reaction to sustained interest among advocacy organizations. Civil rights groups had begun referencing the case in policy discussions regarding best practices in vehicle stop verification procedures. Academic institutions requested permission to reference the timeline as part of criminal justice coursework analyzing decision-making under uncertainty. The incident had evolved into case study territory, because clear documentation allowed structured examination. Within municipal offices, settlement discussions began quietly, not publicly announced, not formally confirmed, but initiated. Settlement did not necessarily represent admission of wrongdoing. Often it represented calculation, financial calculation, reputational calculation, institutional calculation. Extended litigation carried risk beyond monetary damages. Depositions created public record. Internal training materials became subject to disclosure. Prior complaints became part of discovery review. Legal counsel often evaluated whether early resolution better protected institutional stability. City administrators considered policy revision proposals simultaneously. Additional training modules focused on verification sequencing, updated procedural reminders emphasizing confirmation prior to escalation, clarification of documentation review expectations during field encounters. Policy response often accompanied legal response because preventing recurrence carried equal importance to resolving individual claims. Inside Carter and Wynn's office, Eleanor Wynn reviewed a draft communication received from City Legal Counsel indicating openness to settlement discussion. She placed the document on the conference table without commentary. Jordan read carefully. Language remained measured. Professional, non-adversarial, indicative of negotiation readiness. Aaliyah read the document quietly, her expression unchanged. Her interest did not center on financial outcome alone. It centered on acknowledgement, procedural recognition, institutional correction. Because monetary compensation without structural change rarely prevented repetition. Eleanor spoke calmly. "We evaluate terms carefully," she said. Jordan nodded. "Policy revision language may be included." Maya added quietly, public accountability measures as well. Negotiation strategy required balance between resolution and reform, because lasting impact extended beyond individual case outcome. Across the city, media coverage had matured into structured reporting rather than reactive commentary. Journalists referenced federal filing language directly. Legal experts explained constitutional considerations in measured terms. Public conversation had shifted toward broader questions. How often did similar procedural shortcuts occur? How often were they documented? How often were they challenged? Because visibility influenced awareness. Awareness influenced reform. Within the department, training supervisors reviewed internal briefing materials emphasizing updated verification procedures. Sequence mattered. Confirmation before escalation. Documentation review before restraint. Public perception influenced trust. Trust influenced cooperation. Cooperation influenced public safety outcomes. Institutional adaptation often followed visible cases because visibility encouraged reflection. Reflection encouraged revision. As settlement discussions progressed quietly behind closed doors, one conclusion had already become clear across both legal teams. The incident outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel would not disappear unnoticed. It would remain documented, referenced, examined. Because once sequence entered federal record, institutional response rarely remained unchanged, and accountability, when supported by clear documentation, often extended far beyond a single moment on a single sidewalk. In the months that followed the incident outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel, the story did not fade into the background noise of an endless news cycle. Instead, it continued to surface in conversations far removed from the original sidewalk where it began. Law schools discussed it in constitutional law seminars. Community leaders referenced it in public forums focused on trust between institutions and citizens. Professional training programs examined it as an example of how procedural sequencing can influence both perception and outcome. Because the significance of the moment did not lie only in the restraint itself. It lay in what the documentation revealed afterward. Across academic settings, instructors highlighted how quickly assumptions could shape decisions when incomplete information appeared to confirm existing expectations. Students reviewed the timeline carefully, identifying the precise moment when verification could have prevented escalation. Some focused on legal thresholds, others focused on psychological dynamics. Many focused on how easily ordinary interactions could shift when perception influenced interpretation. The incident became a point of discussion not because it was unique, but because it was visible. Visibility allowed examination. Examination allowed learning. Learning allowed adaptation. Civil rights organizations referenced the case in policy discussions, emphasizing procedural clarity during vehicle stop investigations. Workshops incorporated anonymized excerpts from the timeline, encouraging participants to identify decision points where alternative responses might have produced different outcomes. Participants often noted the same pattern: initial uncertainty, assumption of risk, escalation before confirmation, public consequence following visible imbalance. The sequence was instructive precisely because it unfolded in a real-world environment captured from multiple independent perspectives, because theoretical scenarios often failed to convey the complexity of real-time decision-making under perceived pressure. Within law enforcement training environments, instructors used the case to emphasize the importance of verification hierarchy. Confirm identity before escalating. Review documentation thoroughly before applying restraint. Recognize that compliance reduces justification for force, because procedural consistency strengthened both public trust and officer credibility. Several training coordinators referenced the case when updating internal review modules addressing decision-making under ambiguity. Clarification of thresholds. Reinforcement of documentation review expectations. Emphasis on maintaining proportional response aligned with observable behavior. The discussion extended beyond individual departments. Professional associations included the case as part of broader conversation about balancing caution with fairness, because caution without confirmation risked undermining confidence in institutional judgment. At Carter & Wynn Civil Rights Group, Aaliyah continued her work without public commentary beyond formal statements issued through legal channels. Her focus remained consistent: case preparation, client advocacy, policy review consultation, because individual recognition did not alter the underlying purpose of the work. Justice, she believed, required continuity, consistency, patience. Colleagues noticed that her routine remained unchanged. Early mornings reviewing case material, carefully structured schedules, intentional preparation. Her composure during the incident had drawn public attention, But for Aliyah, composure had always been part of the process. Emotion could motivate awareness, but clarity produced results. Several civil rights advocacy groups invited her to participate in panel discussions addressing procedural fairness in investigative encounters. She accepted selectively choosing forums focused on constructive dialogue rather than adversarial debate. During one discussion at a regional legal symposium, a moderator asked what lesson she believed institutions could draw from the incident. Aliyah's response was measured. Verification is not an obstacle to safety. It is a component of safety. The statement resonated across professional circles, because safety included both physical protection and protection from unjust presumption. Policy analysts referenced the phrase in written commentary, examining best practices for maintaining public confidence during investigative procedures, because confidence depended not only on outcome, but on process. Within community forums, the story prompted conversations about how individuals could document interactions responsibly while maintaining respectful distance. Observers discussed the role of technology in shaping transparency. Phones had captured multiple angles, multiple timelines, multiple perspectives. Those perspectives collectively produced a fuller understanding of the sequence than any single source might have provided alone. Technology did not replace procedure, but it reinforced accountability, because visible record encouraged consistent application of established standards. At the municipal level, updated policy guidance incorporated language reinforcing confirmation protocols prior to escalation in ownership disputes involving vehicles. Training modules included practical examples illustrating how quickly public perception could form when escalation appeared disproportionate to observable risk. Because public perception influenced cooperation. Cooperation influenced effectiveness. Effectiveness influenced institutional legitimacy. The ripple effects extended gradually, but meaningfully. Legal journals published analytical articles examining the constitutional considerations involved in public detention scenarios lacking confirmed probable cause. Researchers compared procedural language across jurisdictions, identifying opportunities for improved clarity. Professional organizations recommended standardized phrasing for dispatch alerts involving partial VIN matches, emphasizing the importance of distinguishing preliminary similarity from confirmed identification. Clarity reduced ambiguity. Ambiguity reduced premature escalation. Premature escalation reduced public confidence. Each layer of analysis contributed incrementally to improved understanding. Months later, the video clips still circulated periodically online, often accompanied by commentary focused less on outrage and more on awareness. Awareness of how quickly perception could influence outcome. Awareness of how documentation could support accountability. Awareness that procedural fairness strengthened institutional credibility. For Aliyah, the experience remained part of a broader continuum of work rather than a defining moment, because her focus had never centered on personal recognition. It centered on structural clarity, consistency between written policy and applied procedure, alignment between authority and responsibility. At the Whitmore Grand Hotel, the sidewalk where the incident occurred had long since returned to its ordinary rhythm. Pedestrians moved without hesitation. Vehicles parked without scrutiny. Daily life continued without visible reminder of the moment that had briefly drawn national attention. But the absence of visible reminder did not indicate absence of impact, because impact often extended quietly. Through training revisions, through policy clarification, through awareness that influenced future decisions made in moments of uncertainty. Moments where assumption might once have replaced verification. Moments where sequence might once have shifted prematurely. Moments now informed by documentation demonstrating why confirmation mattered. Because in environments shaped by authority, consistency, strengthened legitimacy, and legitimacy strengthened trust. Trust, once reinforced through accountability, often became the most durable outcome of all. Nearly 9 months after the moment outside the Whitmore Grand Hotel first captured public attention, the case reached its formal conclusion. The resolution did not arrive with spectacle. There were no dramatic courtroom outbursts, no theatrical declarations. Instead, the outcome emerged through the steady structure of legal negotiation supported by documentation that had remained consistent from the beginning. The city of Atlanta agreed to a settlement totaling $7 million. But the monetary figure, while significant, did not represent the full measure of the resolution. Included within the settlement terms were specific institutional commitments, policy clarification regarding verification procedures before restraint in ownership disputes, expanded training modules emphasizing confirmation protocols when documentation is presented voluntarily, additional supervisory review requirements in cases involving public detention absent immediate threat indicators. The language was precise, structured, legally binding, because structural commitments often carried longer-lasting impact than financial compensation alone. The official announcement from City Legal Counsel remained measured. The city affirms its commitment to ensuring that investigative procedures reflect both public safety priorities and constitutional protections. Public statements often relied on careful wording, but wording when tied to enforceable policy revision could produce meaningful change. At Carter and Wynn Civil Rights Group, the conclusion of the case was acknowledged without celebration. Legal resolution represented outcome, not victory, because the objective had never been personal recognition. It had been procedural clarity, institutional accountability, reinforcement of standards that protected both citizens and officers when applied consistently. Jordan Patel reviewed the final settlement documentation once more before closing the file carefully. "The structural provisions matter most," he said quietly. Eleanor Wynn nodded. "Consistency prevents recurrence." Maya Thompson archived the digital case record, ensuring every exhibit remained properly cataloged for future reference. Because precedent influenced future litigation, and future litigation influenced evolving interpretation of constitutional protections. Aaliyah Carter read the final terms calmly, her expression composed as always. Her response remained consistent with the approach she had maintained since the beginning: measured, intentional, focused on process rather than attention. During a brief public statement released through written communication, she addressed the broader significance of the resolution. "Accountability strengthens institutions," the statement read. "Verification strengthens trust." The words reflected her professional philosophy that fairness required consistency, and consistency required adherence to procedure even in moments of uncertainty. Months of discussion surrounding the case had already influenced policy language in several jurisdictions, reviewing their own verification guidelines. Legal journals cited the settlement as part of broader analysis regarding evolving standards in investigatory restraint decisions. Professional training organizations incorporated anonymized references to the case when illustrating how procedural sequencing affected both legal outcomes and public confidence. Because the most enduring legal changes often occurred incrementally, through clarified language, through refined training, through reinforced understanding of how easily misinterpretation could influence real-time decisions. One quiet Saturday morning, long after media attention had shifted elsewhere, Aaliyah drove once again through downtown Atlanta. The city moved with its usual rhythm: construction cranes shifting slowly against the skyline, early pedestrians navigating crosswalks with coffee in hand, delivery trucks lining curbs along familiar streets. Ordinary movement, ordinary routine. The Whitmore Grand Hotel appeared again in the distance, its reflective glass facade unchanged. The same sidewalk where the incident had unfolded now looked indistinguishable from any other morning. Valet attendants coordinated arriving vehicles. Business travelers checked schedules on their phones. Tourists paused briefly near the entrance to orient themselves. Nothing in the physical environment suggested that months earlier, the location had become a focal point of national legal discussion. Because physical spaces often return to normal faster than institutional memory. Aaliyah slowed briefly at the intersection before continuing forward, her hands steady on the steering wheel. The black SUV moved smoothly through traffic indistinguishable from countless other vehicles navigating the city's streets. Control, consistency, continuity. Qualities she had valued long before the incident and would continue valuing long after its resolution. Because individual experiences, even highly visible ones, represented only moments within longer trajectories. Her work continued. Case preparation, client advocacy, policy consultation, ongoing commitment to ensuring that constitutional protections functioned not as abstract ideals, but as practical safeguards applied consistently. The settlement did not erase what had occurred, but it reinforced the principle that documentation could support accountability. That sequence could influence outcome. That procedure, when applied carefully, could prevent unnecessary harm. Across professional networks, the case remained referenced quietly, not as controversy, but as clarification. Clarification of thresholds. Clarification of expectations. Clarification of how easily assumption could influence action when verification remained incomplete, and how documentation could restore balance when imbalance occurred. Because justice rarely appeared as a dramatic moment. More often it appeared as adjustment, correction, improvement, refinement, a process evolving gradually toward consistency. As the city continued its ordinary motion, the impact of the case remained embedded not in headlines, but in revised training materials, updated policy language, and expanded awareness among professionals responsible for making decisions in moments of uncertainty. Because fairness required more than intention. It required structure, consistency, commitment to confirmation before conclusion. And as Aaliyah guided the SUV through the familiar streets, the quiet strength of that principle remained far more enduring than the memory of any single morning's misunderstanding. Justice in its most meaningful form had not simply corrected the past. It had influenced the future.